We're going to place our solder on 1/2. And the reason that we cut long pieces and made them flat is so that they'll stay in place on top of the bead. If they're round, they'll just roll off. So place 5 or 6 pieces of the solder onto the bead. Fairly equally spaced. Light your torch, same flame we always use, a neutral flame. And just slowly heat up your bead because we want the flux to dry out and we want the solder to stay in place. So just really slowly on and off. If the flux bubbles up a lot, it'll just bounce the solder off. Now at this point, you could carefully put your other half on top using your tweezers, because all this will be bloody hot. What you can also do is heat up your first bead just until the solder starts to flow. You don't want it to flow completely, but just until it starts there. Now, when we place this one on top, there's no chance that the solder is going to bounce off because it's there, it's started to melt. Wait until it's cool enough to touch if you want, or you can just take your tweezers, put this on top, put the one that doesn't have solder on top. Don't be tempted to touch it because it never looks hot, but it always is. You can use your solder pick to help. And you just want to fiddle it until it is pretty perfect. Yeah? Because if you solder this and it's not perfect, you won't be able to fix it. It's a major pain in the ass to try to fix a bead. So mess around, yeah, and you want to get it as close as you can. Now, sometimes these act like they're self-centering. When you go to solder it, if it's slightly off, oftentimes it'll center itself, but don't take the chance. What you can do is you can get a metal screen to put on top of this, and the bead sets in the screen a little bit easier. Once you have your bead the way you want it, same neutral flame, and what you want to do is you want to just circle the bead bottom to top, and that way both halves will be the same temperature. The solder will flow, and just work your torch all the way around to make sure that the solder flows all the way around. That's it. I would wait until it's cool before I quenched it and pickled it, just because it doesn't suck the water inside then. But it doesn't really matter. You can quench it if you want. So at this stage, quench it, pickle it, and then we'll sand the edges back. Now if you did this correctly, at this point, you'll be able to see the seam, but it should have solder all the way around, and it should just be slightly proud. So take your sanding stick, hold the bead in your fingers, and just sand right on the seam, following the curve of the bead. Yeah, all the way around, and just to 400 grade paper. If there are a few marks in your bead that shouldn't be there, follow the curve of the bead with the sanding stick, take them out, and when you get the whole bead so that it's a nice satin finish, 400 grade, we'll continue with our project. which is to cut a hole big enough to fit the end of our wire or big enough to fit our tubing. Okay, at this point we're going to make the hole bigger in our bead, and I assume you don't want to hold this in your fingers, so you can hold it in a ring holder. It needs to be fairly snug, and I don't think you'll collapse the bead. Yeah. Now this has leather jaws, so it protects the bead. And we're just going to drill as big a hole as we can using our pendant drill. Now that will only go up to 2.3 millimeters because that's a bigger drill, the biggest drill that you can get to fit the handpiece. So one step at a time, we know that we've got a 1 millimeter hole. Actually, it's bigger because it will have expanded when we were forming it. So just go one step at a time with your drill bits until you get a fairly large hole. And then we're going to use a parallel burr to expand that. And a parallel burr is just that. It's just the same diameter from one end to the other. You can see that that's fairly aggressive, and what you don't want to do is run that against your finger. So just work it around in a circle as you're spinning it. And we know that this hole wants to be 3 millimeters diameter. Number one, to fit the end of our wire, and then it wants to be slightly bigger to fit our tubing. So we're just going, when we get this the right size, we're going to slide this over the end of our wire and just solder it in place using easy solder. And when we get it the right size for the tubing, we'll just slide that in and use easy solder. Then we'll cut it off and tap it. So make your beads. Just remove a small amount at a time because we want a nice snug fit. So as you can see, my tubing fits in quite nicely. There's a bit of a ragged edge where the burr is pulled it up. Just use your sanding stick, go over the top, get it smooth, wipe it off, make sure your tubing is clean, put it inside, and I would just, at this point, I would just solder the tubing in. After I pickle it and dry it, then I just cut it off and file it back.